Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. And well, with the world changing around us, I'm very happy to have my special guest this week in studio with us, a guest who's no stranger to dialogues. He was actually on the first show, perhaps because it is a conversation of ideas. And who better to discuss ideas with than Shashi Tharoor, out with his new book, his latest book, Prejudice and Punditry, and quite a journey you've made there. When you look at that, really, the perspective of both, in a sense, somebody who looks at history with great passion, writes about it, but is also somebody who's an active politician in the politics of today. How do you find that journey?
Well, you know, I'm in a slightly peculiar position because with history, obviously, I'm a student. I've never met most of the people I write about, not even Nehru, with whom at least 7 or 8 years of my life overlapped. But I've actually studied their work, read them, listened to speeches, and so on, and therefore I write with a certain level of passion, even though I have some detachment. Mm-hmm. With politics, these are issues with which I am personally actively engaged, and I write about people whom I actually meet and interact with. And that puts me in a different position. The same degree of detachment is not possible. So I am, one speaks jokingly about punditry, but I am not a detached commentator. Mm-hmm. I'm not somebody outside the fray. I'm in the fray. And therefore my writing is that of an engaged participant and not just that of an observer. That's the main difference. Otherwise, I hope I bring the same sort of mind, sensibility, and interest and awareness to both sets of writings.
So you're a Nehruvian at a time when it is extremely unfashionable or not in sync with the times we live in somehow when we look at Nehru today.
Well, you know, I'm a Nehruvian, yes, and yet no, because as those who read my book on Nehru will tell you, I'm not an uncritical hagiographer. I think what he did to instill democratic institutions in our country, to bring about respect for democratic practice and culture, was absolutely invaluable and is a towering achievement. And I think his strong and resolute insistence on inclusion, on pluralism, on respecting India's diversity, on what we call secularism, though the word is as a word debatable, but the concept of it is not. It seems to me that too is something that really needs reaffirming at a time when these basics are being challenged. I think on economics, there are many things that ended up not necessarily serving India well. I think at the beginning, it was essential, his approach. Later, what it became, and under the ossification that took place later, may have actually not been so positive. And foreign policy, obviously, was crafted in a different era. Mm-hmm. So I have a full-fledged appreciation, but I'm not saying that everything that Nehru said and did is gospel. I'm saying there's a lot there to admire. And the more I see the attacks against him, the more I'm determined to affirm what is valuable and precious in the Nehruvian inheritance. And it's not fashionable because, unfortunately or otherwise, the people who've come to power today have come to power without a full appreciation of what has gone before them. Unlike the previous BJP government of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, because Vajpayee had a very clear appreciation of Nehru. He delivered the finest eulogy in India's parliament after Nehru's death. And there's this wonderful story, I don't think it's in this book, but one of my other books, of how Vajpayee came to the Prime Minister's office and was surprised to discover that an overzealous bureaucrat had removed the picture of Nehru he'd always seen in the Prime Minister's office. So he asked, what happened to this picture? And the bureaucrat said, we thought you were coming, you wouldn't want it. He said, bring it back instantly. And throughout his time as Prime Minister, there was a picture of Jawaharlal Nehru in the office of the Prime Minister of India, because he knew he was standing on the shoulders of a giant like Nehru. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, Mr. Modi and his cohort have no such perception, no value for what was built that they're standing upon, and as a result, they continue to demonize Nehru, which makes me all the more determined to fight back in Nehru's corner.
In fact, what you write about, and even in your previous books, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, for instance, I don't know if I should use the word relationship, but your insights or your interactions with Prime Minister Modi have been fascinating. And in this book, you write, there's a chapter called Modi and Me, which centers around a lunch you had when he was then Chief Minister of Gujarat, and you just before you left the UN. Tell us about that.
No, it was an interesting occasion because I hadn't expected to meet him. I had been invited to lunch by a UPA minister at the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, which happened to be an event that the Chief Minister of Gujarat was attending, and he was also invited. I don't know whether he knew I was coming. I didn't know he was, but I walked into the room and there he was. And of course, for people like me, as growing up as an NRI, you read sort of Western accounts of what went on in India and so on. So Modi was not exactly a figure one would have sought to meet, because at that point he had been portrayed in a wholly negative light. But to my surprise, he seemed to know who I was. He greeted me. He was very affable. And me being me, I asked him all the tough questions. And I must say he responded very unflinchingly. Now, whether you accept his replies or not is different. But the fact that he didn't duck the questions, he answered them directly and in a disarming way. I mean, and then he sort of volunteered a couple of anecdotes himself, one of which I've recounted in the book, where he, I had asked him about the treatment of Hindus, what happened in 2002. I'd asked him all the questions you can expect that somebody meeting him for the first time after that tragedy would have done. And then I asked about this question of the perception that even though there had been no violence or anything in the 5 years thereafter when I met him, I said there's still a perception that Muslims are not given a fair shake, that they're kind of ghettoized in parts of Gujarat and so on. And then he said this interesting story. He said, this is what the Sachar Commission people thought. He didn't name the Sachar Commission. There was a group that was writing something. And they came to see me. And they said, we hear you're not doing anything for Muslims in your state. And he said, yes, I'm doing nothing for Muslims in my state. Write it down, he said. And the way he tells the story was very good. He said they took out their notebooks, they took out their pens, and they wrote down, I'm doing nothing for Muslims in my state. Then he said, write this also. I'm doing nothing for Hindus in my state. I'm only working for Gujaratis. Now, this kind of message, I mean, obviously it was very skilled, very polished, very effective. But you can imagine that for someone like me, it broadened my mind about what exactly was Modi's appeal, what he stood for, and how he communicated to others. It was a very interesting thing. Subsequently, of course, when he conducted the 2014 campaign, even though obviously I was a strong opponent, and I at that point had a pretty large social media following. He'd only overtaken me in July of 2013. What I said did make a difference, and he clearly noticed it, because at one point during the campaign, he invited me publicly to call for more voter enrollment. And I said, you're welcome to join me, because I've just done this in my constituency, calling for more voter enrollment and so on. But anyway, so we'd had these things, and when he won, and I somewhat grudgingly at the end of the day tweeted my congratulations, I was startled when he responded with alacrity. I'm not suggesting he writes his own tweets, but clearly he had to authorize it. Congratulating me, thanking me, and saying we must work together for the betterment of the country. Now, that's the right sort of message to give a vanquished opposition, I thought. And then indeed, meeting him as Prime Minister on a few occasions, that also happened.
In fact, but I think this, the analysis, or perhaps the nuances that you bring to your analysis of the Prime Minister is often what gets you into trouble. I think the fact that nowadays in any political debate there is no nuance at all, it's black or
white. Black and white, yeah.
Often gets you into trouble. How do you, and in fact this is a question, in your punditry, you stay very well away from the leadership of your own party. So for instance, you never do punditry on, say, Mrs. Gandhi or Rahul or Priyanka Gandhi, or even of opposition leaders like Mamata Banerjee or, say, Arvind Kejriwal. Why are they off limits? Because
I suppose
you've often gone to trouble, so is it a sense of self-preservation?
Well, self-preservation is part of it, I suppose, at some subconscious level, but it's also, frankly, if you like, old-world courtesy. I was brought up to behave in a civil way to people I have to work with, engage with professionally, and common sense will also tell you that you don't critique, insult, or write about people whom tomorrow you may have to go to and ask for a favor for your constituency, or tomorrow you have to work with in a particular political context. You don't insult them. In fact, I remember a wonderful line by Kofi Annan to me when we were discussing about some of the problems he was having with the Americans at one point in the UN on a particular issue. And people said, why don't you publicly denounce the American stand? And he said, well, my father taught me an old Ghanaian proverb: never hit a man on the head when you've got your fingers between his teeth. You think about it, if your fingers, you hit him on the head, your fingers are going to go. And that's the point. In the case of a UN Secretary General, he is dependent on the superpower, the Americans, and his fingers are therefore metaphorically in their teeth. You don't hit him on the head when he will suffer, he will not have their cooperation in future. Similarly, these are people I need to work with and be civil to and be courteous to for all sorts of practical reasons, including the interests of the people who voted for me, my own constituents. I'm surprised that people don't fully appreciate that. But I don't think you'll find too many serving politicians writing about other serving politicians. It doesn't really happen. No. When they die, yes. So I've written a few obituaries of Sushma Ji and Jaswant Singh Sahab and so on, which are not in this book. But I have no problem. And Jaitley, who was a friend from my university days, and I've written about them, even though while they were alive, I never did.
You know, you'll find, I think, no serving politicians writing about others or writing at all, really, in a sense. But you will find, and you made the point about insults, why insult anyone? But you will find now that the language of political discourse against anyone, whether it's within your own party who's seen as dissenters or whether it's against opposition parties, is extremely crude, crass. And we've seen what happened. In fact, in one of the chapters in your book, you talk about this debate on Hindutva versus Hinduism. And we've seen what happened with the colleague Salman Khurshid when his house was vandalized in Nainital. It's something you condemned. It happened with Kapil Sibal when again he expressed something when you had Congress workers land up. Do you now feel sometimes that your brand of politics doesn't fit in with what's happening, whether it's in your own party or even in just political India today? Right.
You remember Raju ban gaya gentleman. I mean, you can't be a gentleman in Indian politics without people either mistrusting you, abusing you for your alleged motives, or questioning the sincerity of your convictions. So, for me, I see no contradiction in having opposed Lal Krishna Advani from the days of the Rath Yatra, before the demolition of the Babri Masjid, right through to the present day politically, but being very civil to him, wishing him on his birthday, greeting him in person. I mean, there've been a couple of celebrations at his home that, like many other opposition politicians, I attended. The only thing is that somehow when I make it public that I have done so, I get this vituperation that I'm somehow, as somebody charmingly called me, a fascist enabler. Now, this I think is ridiculous, because your substantive beliefs, the principles and values you stood for all your life, written about, articulated and fought for, they don't suddenly disappear because you wish somebody happy birthday. But that's precisely the kind of environment.
But the criticism often comes from within your own party as well.
Well, these are supporters of my party to some degree. There are also people further to the left of my party who are also doing the attacking. Who knows? But the fact is that at this stage I would say that this demand for, what used to be called the Manichaean view of the world. The Manichaean view of the world is everyone is either good or evil. Everything is either right or wrong. And this black and white thing, this has become a very, very strong element of the polarization that has divided our country's society as well as our politics. And I think it's most unfortunate, because normally, why is it that we willingly give up power when we lose an election? Because we should have that faith and trust that the people who won the election are as much committed in their own, we consider, misguided way to the well-being of the country and of the people of the country. And they should be convinced that if they lose and we come back to power, that they too can hand over to us peacefully, because we too are committed to the well-being of the country. Now, that basic level of trust ought to engender some mutual respect, some cooperation, some conversation. It's far, far too little. And I think many will tell you that the warmth and friendships that used to be seen across party lines. I'm only in politics 13 years, but let's go back to the past, of the somewhat distant past. That's largely disappeared. And the kind of public respect Nehruji would express for parties, opposition politicians. You will never see somebody from the ruling party doing that today for an opposition leader, or vice versa.
But just coming to this whole debate on Hinduism versus Hindutva, and I'm sure that many within the Congress wonder why it keeps being brought up, because of course controversial views perhaps that Mr. Khurshid had comparing Hindutva, or the political arm of what he says of Hinduism, to Boko Haram or ISIS. Now these are often issues, even though the paragraph may be taken out of context, which is not something which any political party would like its people to be saying, and yet you write about this quite often also.
There are various levels at which you can consider this, Sonia. First, I do think Salman was misunderstood. I haven't read the book, but what I understand from him is that he was referring to acts of violence being conducted by people in the name of Hindutva. Now, what Hindutva ought to do then is to disown them. If the people who go around beating up Muslims and saying, say, Jai Shri Ram, are not genuinely the voices of Hindutva, they should be said so. But people who conduct acts of violence is what Salman was referring to. Secondly, to call Hindutva the political arm of Hinduism is completely wrong. Hindutva has nothing to do with Hinduism. Hinduism is a religion. It's a quest. It's the individual seeking for the union of his Atman with the divine. I mean, that's essentially what Hinduism as a religion is all about. It is not about a badge of political identity, which is what Hindutva is. You can't take a religion that is full of respect for others, of doubt and incertitude about ultimate truth, that demands of the believer that he be a seeker, that respects a lot of interiority, that accepts difference, not just tolerates, but accepts difference, says that I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. That kind of faith has nothing to do with the kind of Hindutva doctrine, a political ideology that has reduced Hinduism to the level of the British football hooligan who goes around saying, I'm a supporter of this team, if you're supporting another team, I'll hit you on the head with my placard. I mean, that is simply not Hindu Dharma. That's not what any of the spiritual leaders have ever taught us, from Adi Shankara to Vivekananda and onwards. So we have to understand that the separation conceptually, intellectually, of Hinduism from Hindutva is absolutely one. The Hindutva brigade cannot be allowed to claim a monopoly of the political expression of Hinduism. Having said which, how can there be only one political expression of Hinduism? Hinduism is a faith that manifests itself in multiple. We have 330 million names of God and worship, forms of worship. Why should we confine ourselves to one particular political party? This is what they want for their political advantage. And many people, including within my party, say, why even get into this debate, because you're playing into their hands. They want to cloak themselves in the mantle of being the political party of the Hindus, in which case they have an automatic permanent majority in this country. Whereas it's in our interest to say, being a Hindu is something you do in the privacy of your home. Let's talk about the well-being of the people. Let's talk about governance. Let's talk about development. Let's talk about well-being and welfare. That's what politics should be all about. Politics should be about material things, about here and now. Religion should be about spiritual things and the hereafter.
But is the reality that whether it's your party or whether it's, say, the Aam Aadmi Party or any party, that somehow the approach is almost that, well, if you can't beat them, join them. So let's all show how proud we are, whether it's a question of proud Hindus or proud Sikhs or proud Christians, or in that sense, being the Muslim, just because of the numbers, the fact that, of course, Hindus are a majority in this country, is now no longer relevant in Indian politics. And I'm sure in that way the Christian is no longer relevant in Indian politics, because who is their constituency? Who is the Hindutva light version, as you've said, that's a path the Congress shouldn't go through. Do you think that's perhaps just real politics today?
No, I think there's a difference between, this is really a question of political tactics. In other words, do you try and neutralize the BJP's claims to being Hindu by saying and showing we're also Hindu, which is what some colleagues very strongly believe we should do. And the others would say, let's not even get into that space. Let's completely keep out of religion, say that we're only interested in politics without religion. And there are those like me who are somewhere in between who do a bit of both. In my case, I've seen religions as a purely private activity, but I go to temples in my constituency and often at the request of my supporters who are given some vow or some promise that I have to fulfill by sitting on a scale and being weighed against bananas. You know, these are things that happen. But I also go to mosques, I also go to churches all the time because it's a way of also showing respect for what matters to my voters, to my constituents. And that's something that politicians should normally do. But I don't define my politics in terms of religion, and I certainly don't define my faith in terms of politics. The two for me are completely apart, and I think that's what we need to do much more clearly in the national political space.
So how do you answer when the ruling party says the opposition enjoys anti-India headlines? The opposition is anti-national. Comedian Veer Das is anti-national.
You know, this anti-national talk has gone far too far. Every one of us is committed to India, the well-being of India, the success, prosperity of India. But we want to be proud of India. We don't want to be having to defend and explain in India where some poor Muslim is beaten up repeatedly and ordered to say Jai Shri Ram. We don't want an India where Dalits are lynched for skinning a cow. We don't want an India where people are bathing themselves in cow dung and saying this will cure every disease known to man. I mean, people are obviously not going to be able to talk about this India abroad with any great deal of confidence or pride. So that kind of thing that leads to negative images of India abroad certainly we're not happy with. When foreign countries issue advisories telling women not to travel alone to India because it's a place where women are going to be assaulted, is that something we should be proud of? Of course not. So let's be aware of what the foreign countries are saying about us, which in the past used to be a much more positive story and of late is not so. And let's try and deal with the problems at home. If we solve the problems, then the story will be better. I mean, to be honest, this business of massaging stories for propaganda, which is what the government and its acolytes seem to specialize in, is wrong. Solve the actual substance of the issue. The story, the good stories will be told after that.
If you, as a student of history and as
and by the way, there's nothing anti-national about wanting better for your nation. As far as I'm concerned, it's the most patriotic thing you can do to criticize your government when it's going wrong and doing the wrong things, saying the wrong things.
When it becomes a larger pattern, it's not just about the individual hassle and process, which is a nightmare, I'm sure, and we'll come to that, but also the point about the chilling effect, as the Supreme Court said on freedom of speech, whether it's on the media, whether it's on a voice, whether it's on Bollywood staying silent when actor Shah Rukh Khan's son is arrested in jail for 20 days without having any drugs on him, that it becomes a larger pattern of fear in society. Do you find that today, that people are scared to speak up? I mean, Vedas made that point in the same, but people are, in fact, perhaps stand-up comedians are the ones who are speaking up when often politicians don't, the media doesn't, actors definitely don't, cricketers won't, everyone's scared.
That's right. So fear is something so subjective, you'll have to ask the silent individuals whether they're acting out of fear, prudence, common sense, or protection of their income. I don't know what it is, but all the people you mentioned have chosen to stay silent. And in fact, it's only a handful who have decided to brave the wrath of the authorities and go ahead and speak. And most of us are in politics and public life, and therefore we are given a greater license than somebody who's actually making their living from the goodwill of the public, whether actors, cricketers, whatever, and who feel that caution dictates silence rather than the expression of their views. I think that's very unfortunate. I think one of the great things about our democracy was how willing we were to express our opinions. In fact, I remember when I was a student in America reading articles during the emergency by journalists saying the shocking thing about India is this is a country where you always heard every opinion on every side of every issue all the time, and suddenly in the public space it's all silence. But the journalists would say you can still go to coffee houses and hear all these opinions being expressed quietly by individuals once they know that nobody listening is going to be a government informant. That's not what a democracy used to be, and we were all very relieved when the emergency ended, elections were held, and people were able to go back to being their opinionated selves. The Argumentative Indians of Amartya Sen's famous book title. Today, we're still argumentative Indians, but a lot of people are very wary of what they can get away with in the public space, because it always seems to attract a certain level of punishment.
Even a cricketing icon like Virat Kohli, when he defends Mohammad Shami, faces the most hideous and vile threats. You've written about cricket also in this book. What would you say to Virat Kohli today?
I said it already, shabash. I think he really, really did the right thing. In fact, in some ways, I wish he'd done it sooner, because the defeat was on a Sunday, and his statement waited all the way till the following Friday or Saturday on the eve of the next match. I wish that, within the 24, 48 hours that Shami was being abused, that he'd immediately come out and said this is nonsense and stop it. But I must say that he did the right thing, he said the right thing, and I hope that he will continue to speak out like that when this kind of thing happens. There's also the code of camaraderie amongst players in a sporting team, that if you hit one of us, the rest of us will stand up for him. That should not be violated either. That's a value in and of itself if you want a team to hold together and play effectively together.
Absolutely. And Shashi, in this book also, there are 2 love poems to your late wife, Sunanda.
The first one was to her. The second one is just another piece.
So maybe if you could quote a bit of that, because of course this year has also seen finally the end to a court case which has dragged on and has seen you vilified as well.
Oh yeah, no, I was vilified. I actually wrote the poem a few weeks after her death, when the memories were fresh and very painful, and before the worst of all these accusations and vilifications had left me utterly bewildered. I mean, it was, for everyone who knew us and knew me, including her own brothers and son, it was unthinkable, the things that were being said later, and by people who had no connection with us, didn't know her, didn't know anything about either her own internal struggles or her own situation and health or anything. They just wanted to score political points, and I happened to be, as a victim of a tragedy that was otherwise inexplicable, an obvious target. And so they went for me, but it was a shame that, the media culture of the trial by fire, the Agni Pariksha that the media subjects you to, the number of channels that openly, essentially, called, or in some cases just very strongly implied that I had done complicit things, the channels that made up lies, made up things that had never happened and asserted them as a verifiable fact, all of these things that happened, and therefore the resultant pressure on the police and on the ruling authorities to do something to appease this kind of witch hunt. All of that is something that was a very, very sobering experience for someone like me who had always been a great advocate of the media. I grew up as the son of a newspaperman, and I always used to joke that I had newspaper ink flowing through my veins. I used to visit the printing press of the Statesman when I was like 8, 9 years old. I've seen all of these things from childhood. I had journalists amongst my friends, people who worked for my father, with my father.
No, it was horrible.
And all of that. And yes. For me to see the press behaving the way it is, becoming not just witness, which is the press's job, but also judge, jury, and executioner, I find that really shocking. And I find that the press in India really can do better by itself because it needs to serve our democracy.
Of course.
I mean, if you are, instead of being that fine scalpel that cuts across the bad stuff and exposes it to the nation, you become a blunt axe, then how are you serving our democracy? How are you serving the nation? But anyways, all of that happened, and indeed the police, having done many, many years of inquiries and reopenings of the case, all sorts of things, finally filed a bizarre FIR accusing me of abetting a suicide when there was no proof that any suicide had even happened. And in these circumstances, what happened in the end was perhaps predictable, but given the environment in our country, some would say that the judge had to show exceptional courage to actually call it like it was and say that there is no basis for this case, that there's no evidence of suicide, of murder, of any other wrong, and how on earth could this case have been brought forward. And it was a very detailed judgment, which I hope will stand up to anyone who wants to look at it. And then as far as I'm concerned, I feel no particular great relief or consolation. Other than that, a long nightmare seems to be finally at an end.
And
but now, going back
in
that poem written 7 years ago, when the wounds were fresh of her death, but not yet of all the lies and vilification, there is a certain innocence to it. So I'm happy it's there in the book.
I'd love you to quote a few lines.
For Sunanda now gone, sequin saris and swirling Peshawaris, lehengas and blue jeans too, designer dresses with sparkling zaris, they all remind me of you. Kashmiri wazwans, reclining divans, mountains that sparkle with dew, army officers and their loyal jawans, they all remind me of you. Lyrics in Hindi, stick-on bindi, movies seen by all or a few, songs recited from Pune to Pindi, they all remind me of you. Raucous laughter now and hereafter, pink champagne out of the blue, French jokes, daft and some even dafter, all remind me of you. Multiple pillows, seats next to windows, airplanes and airports so new, tickets and trolleys, business class rows always remind me of you. The rustle of sheets, a drummer's beats, a dance in the dark or two, rousing applause for a movie star's feats, they all remind me of you. Tears in the night, rage that takes flight, tantrums that drown out, please sue, kind words and kisses that dispel my fright, they all remind me of you. Now you are gone and I am forlorn, sometimes I'm down and quite blue, the darkness won't fade when light comes at dawn, for it all reminds me of you. But when rain comes or shine or wet or fine, I imagine what's false and so true. I sigh and I pine, I miss what was mine, the world reminds me of you.
Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for being on the NDTV Dialogues.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.